Wait, don't jail him. Homeless veteran on trial. When judge hears his name, entire courtroom rises. The municipal court of Riverdale was unusually crowded that Wednesday morning. Outside autumn rain pattered against the century-old windows, creating a somber symphony that matched the mood within. The mahogany benches, worn smooth by decades of anxious visitors, creaked under the weight of spectators and defendants awaiting their turn before Judge Olivia Parker. At the back of the courtroom, Mason Quinn sat alone. His weathered hands, once steady enough to save lives under enemy fire, now trembled slightly as they rested on knees covered by faded military surplus pants. His gray beard, untrimmed for months, couldn't hide the proud jawline that had once graced military portraits. At 69, Mason's eyes still held the piercing clarity of a man who had seen too much. Though few bothered to look closely enough to notice, 3 years on the streets had taught Mason to be invisible. After his apartment building was converted to luxury condominiums, his modest veteran's pension couldn't cover rising rents anywhere in the city. The shelter system, overwhelmed and underfunded, offered only temporary respite from the elements. Most nights, he found refuge in the doorway of the old Riverdale Library, where the security guard, a Gulf War veteran himself, pretended not to see him until morning rounds began. Docket number 47623, City of Riverdale versus Mason Quinn, called the court clerk, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Charges of loitering and trespassing on private property. Mason rose slowly, his left knee shattered by shrapnel in Fallujah, protesting the movement. He made his way to the defendant's table, passing the young public defender, whose overflowing briefcase suggested Mason was just one of 30 cases he'd handled before lunch. The lawyer barely glanced up from his papers, having spent all of 4 minutes discussing Mason's case in the holding area earlier. Mr. Quinn is charged with trespassing and loitering at Riverdale First National Bank. The prosecutor announced her tone, suggesting she was reciting a grocery list. Rather than potentially condemning a man to jail time, security footage shows the defendant sleeping in the bank's heated ATM vestibule on 3 consecutive nights last week, refusing to leave when asked by security personnel. Judge Parker adjusted her glasses and looked down at Mason from her bench. At 45, she had earned a reputation for efficiency. Some said at the expense of compassion in a system choking on its own backlog. As she prepared to speak, she noted something in the file before her that made her pause. "Mr. Quinn," she began, her voice carrying the professional detachment honed over 15 years on the bench. "It says here you're a veteran." "Yes, Your Honor." Mason replied, his voice stronger than his appearance would suggest. "United States Marine Corps, ma'am, served from 1973 to 1995, with additional deployment during Operation Iraqi Freedom." The judge's practiced neutral expression faltered for the briefest moment. "Were you by any chance stationed in Fallujah in 2004? She asked, an unusual personal question that caused the prosecutor to look up from her notes. "Yes, Your Honor, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines." Mason answered, standing a bit straighter. Despite himself, Judge Parker's knuckles whitened as they gripped the edge of her bench. "Sergeant Mason Quinn," she asked, her voice losing its judicial formality. Mason's brow furrowed in confusion. "Yes, ma'am." Judge Parker rose from her seat, an unprecedented breach of courtroom protocol that sent murmurs rippling through the gallery. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes. She announced, her voice not entirely steady. Without further explanation, she stepped down from the bench and disappeared through the door to her chambers, leaving a bewildered courtroom in her wake. In her chambers, Judge Parker's hands trembled as she pulled a framed photograph from her desk drawer. The image showed a young Marine in desert fatigues, his arm around a fellow soldier, both grinning. Despite the dusty hell of Iraq visible in the background, she ran her finger over the inscription at the bottom, "To my sister Liv, your prayers worked. St. Quinn pulled us out when no one else would try. Love, Michael." She hadn't made the connection immediately. Quinn was a common enough surname, and she had no reason to think the homeless veteran before her court was the same man her brother had written about in tear-stained letters from the field hospital. The same man who, according to Michael, had carried him 3 kilometers through active combat zones after their unit was ambushed, despite suffering his own injuries. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called quickly, wiping her eyes. Alexander Rossi, a local attorney known for his pro bono work with veterans, stepped into the office. They had attended law school together, though their paths had diverged dramatically since hers. To the steady climb through the prosecutor's office, to the bench his, to a modest practice focused more on justice than profits. "Olivia, I was in the hallway when they called Quinn's case," Alex said. Without preamble, "I know him from the Veterans Outreach Center. He needs representation, not a rushed plea deal." Judge Parker looked at her old friend, then back at the photograph. "Alex, do you know who Mason Quinn is? What he did in Iraq? I know he's a decorated Marine who's been sleeping on our streets for 3 years because the VA lost his paperwork during a system migration." Alex replied, his frustration evident. "I know he's got untreated PTSD that makes it nearly impossible for him to navigate the bureaucracy designed to help him. And I know he's not a criminal for trying to stay warm. He saved Michael's life," she said quietly, turning the photograph so Alex could see it. Understanding dawned on his face. "Your brother Michael. The reason you started the Veterans Legal Aid Program." She nodded. "Michael came home because of Mason Quinn, and now I find the man responsible sitting in my courtroom homeless and facing charges for seeking shelter." Her judicial demeanor cracked further. "How does this happen, Alex? How do we let the people who sacrifice everything for us end up with nothing?" Alex placed his briefcase on her desk and opened it. "It happens because we let it, but not today, not this time." He pulled out a folder. "I've been gathering information on Mason for months, trying to help him navigate the benefit system. I have his complete military record here, including commendations that never made it into his VA file. I need to recuse myself." Judge Parker said, her legal training reasserting itself. "There's a clear conflict of interest." Or, Alex suggested, "you could use your position to ensure justice is actually served for once." He placed the folder on her desk. "Read this before you decide, then do what you think is right." As Alex left, Judge Parker opened the folder and began to read. The official military documents told a story very different from the desperate man sitting in her courtroom. 3 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star commendations from commanding officers spanning 2 decades, and a nomination for the Navy Cross that had somehow never been processed for the very action that had saved her brother's life. The buzzer on her desk reminded her that the 15-minute recess was nearly over. She had a decision to make, When Judge Parker returned to the courtroom, Alexander Rossi stood beside Mason at the defendant's table. "Your Honor," the public defender began, "Mr. Rossi has asked to take over representation for Mr. Quinn. The request is granted." Judge Parker said without hesitation. She then addressed the bailiff. "Please clear the first row of seating and find Mr. Quinn a more comfortable chair." The unusual request raised eyebrows, but the bailiff complied. Mason looked confused as he was ushered to a padded chair normally reserved for expert witnesses. "Mr. Rossi, how does your client plead to the charges?" Judge Parker asked, her judicial tone firmly back in place. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Alex replied, "and we request dismissal of all charges on multiple grounds, including necessity and the city's failure to provide adequate shelter alternatives as required by the Jensen settlement." The prosecutor began to object, but Judge Parker raised her hand. "Before we proceed, I believe it's important to establish some facts about the defendant." She looked directly at Mason. "Mr. Quinn, the court has been made aware of your military service record. Would you object to having that information read into the record?" Mason shifted uncomfortably. "No, Your Honor, though it's not relevant to—" "I believe it is relevant to establishing character." "Mr. Quinn," she interrupted gently. "With the court's indulgence, I'll summarize." The prosecutor looked increasingly confused, but remained silent as Judge Parker began. "Mason Quinn enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1973 at the age of 17. He served with distinction during multiple deployments, including operations in Grenada, Panama, and the First Gulf War. After retiring in 1995, he was recalled to active duty in 2003 as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, due to his expertise in combat medicine and Arabic language skills." Mason stared at his hands, embarrassment coloring his weathered face. On November 17, 2004, then, Sergeant Quinn's unit was ambushed outside Fallujah. Despite sustaining significant injuries to his left leg and side, Sergeant Quinn returned to an active combat zone not once, but 3 times to retrieve wounded Marines after the initial evacuation. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. The last Marine he retrieved was a Lance Corporal Michael Parker, who had been presumed dead. Sergeant Quinn carried Lance Corporal Parker 3 kilometers to the nearest field hospital despite his own injuries and continued enemy fire. A small gasp escaped from someone in the gallery, but Judge Parker continued, "For his actions, Sergeant Quinn was awarded a Purple Heart, his 3rd, and was nominated for the Navy Cross, our nation's 2nd highest military decoration. That nomination was apparently lost in administrative processing." She paused, collecting herself. "Lance Corporal Parker was my younger brother." The revelation sent a shock wave through the courtroom. Mason's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly focusing on the judge's face, searching for traces of the young man he'd carried through the streets of Fallujah. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "while this is certainly moving, I must question its relevance to the charges at hand." "The relevance, counselor, is context," Judge Parker replied firmly. "Mr. Quinn is not being charged because he is inherently criminal. He is being charged because our systems failed him, forcing him to seek shelter in the only warm, dry place he could find on a freezing night." Alex Rossi stood. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to submit additional evidence regarding Mr. Quinn's current situation." At the judge's nod, he approached the bench with another folder. "These documents show that Mr. Quinn has been attempting to navigate the VA benefit system for over 3 years. His housing voucher application was lost twice. His disability rating, which should be at 100% given his documented injuries and PTSD diagnosis, was incorrectly calculated at 30%. His appeals have been pending for 27 months. Judge Parker reviewed the papers, her expression darkening. "Mr. Quinn, were you aware that you qualified for priority housing assistance through the HUD-VASH program?" Mason shook his head. "I was told I needed additional documentation. Your Honor, I've been trying to get copies of my medical records, but..." He trailed off, the exhaustion of fighting bureaucracy evident in his voice. "And where have you been staying while waiting for these issues to be resolved?" "Different places, ma'am. The shelter, when there's space. The library doorway most nights. The bank vestibule when the temperature drops below freezing." "And that's why you were in the bank's ATM area?" "Yes, Your Honor. It was 28 degrees that night. I try not to stay in the same place too often, but with my knee..." He gestured to his left leg. "Sometimes I can't walk far enough to find a new spot." Alex placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, a quiet show of support. Judge Parker turned to the prosecutor. "Given these circumstances, does the city wish to proceed with charges?" The prosecutor, sensing the shifting winds, cleared her throat. "The city would be willing to consider community service in lieu of prosecution, Your Honor." "That won't be necessary," Judge Parker said firmly. "This court finds that the defendant's actions were born of necessity and that no criminal intent existed. All charges are dismissed." She then addressed Mason directly. "Mr. Quinn, this court apologizes for the failures that led you to this point. Mr. Rossi has agreed to continue representing you pro bono to expedite your VA claims." Mason nodded, a mix of confusion and relief on his face. "Court is adjourned for lunch recess." Judge Parker announced, "We will reconvene at 1:30 p.m. As people began to file out, she added, "Mr. Quinn and Mr. Rossi, please remain." Once the courtroom had emptied, Judge Parker stepped down from the bench and approached Mason. Up close, she could see the toll that years of hardship had taken on the once powerful Marine Sergeant Quinn. She said deliberately, using his military rank, "I don't know if you remember my brother Michael. It's been almost 20 years. Mason's eyes, clouded by cataracts beginning to form, studied her face. "Parker," he said slowly, "skinny kid from Minnesota, always carried a pocket Bible." A faint smile crossed his lips. "Had a sister in law school. He wouldn't shut up about..." Tears welled in Judge Parker's eyes. "That's him. He made it home because of you. He's a doctor now working at the VA in Minneapolis." "Good," Mason said simply. "He was a good kid. Smart deserved to come home." "So did you," she replied, "and you deserved better than what happened after." Mason shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes about his resignation to life's injustices. "Lots of us ended up this way, ma'am." "Nothing special about my situation," Alex interjected. "That's where you're wrong, Mason. What happened to you isn't just unfortunate, it's a failure of the system you risked your life to protect." Judge Parker nodded in agreement. "Mr. Rossi, what would it take to get Mr. Quinn's situation resolved immediately?" Before Alex could answer, the courtroom doors burst open. A court security officer rushed in, followed by a man in an expensive suit. "Judge Parker, I apologize for the interruption," the security officer said, "but this gentleman insists on speaking with you regarding the Quinn case." The suited man stepped forward. "Judge Parker, I'm Richard Townsend, head of security for First National Bank. One of our tellers recognized Mr. Quinn from the news article last month about homeless veterans. Mason tensed, expecting more trouble. The bank has no interest in pursuing charges. Townsend continued. In fact, our CEO is appalled that Mr. Quinn was arrested for seeking shelter on our property. We'd like to offer assistance. Judge Parker looked skeptical. What kind of assistance? For starters, we have a vacant property, a foreclosed home that's been fully renovated and is ready for occupancy. We'd like to offer it to Mr. Quinn while his benefit situation is resolved. Mason began to shake his head. I don't need charity. It's not charity, sir. Townsend interrupted respectfully. Our bank has a veterans housing initiative that's been underutilized. This would actually help us meet our community reinvestment goals. Alex looked at Mason. It would be temporary just until we get your VA benefits straightened out. Having a stable address would actually help expedite the process. Mason still looked uncertain. Judge Parker knelt beside his chair, protocol completely abandoned. Now, Mason, she said quietly, my brother is alive because you didn't leave him behind. Please don't make us leave you behind now. The proud Marine's resistance crumbled at the echo of his own military code. He gave a barely perceptible nod. Judge Parker straightened and addressed Townsend. Mr. Townsend, the court appreciates the bank's offer. Mr. Rossi will coordinate the details. She then turned to Alex. I'm calling Michael. He needs to know what's happening, and he may be able to help navigate the VA system from his end. As Townsend left to make arrangements, an unexpected complication arose. The court clerk returned looking concerned. Judge Parker, there's a reporter from the Riverdale Gazette asking questions about today's proceedings. Apparently, someone tipped them off about a homeless veteran case being dismissed under unusual circumstances. Mason's face fell. I don't want to be in the papers. Alex and Judge Parker exchanged glances, both recognizing that publicity could cut both ways. Bringing attention to Mason's plight might help expedite his case, but it would also violate his privacy and dignity. It's your call. Mason, Alex said, but consider this. Your story might help other veterans in similar situations. Mason looked torn. The Marine in him wanted to help his brothers in arms, but the private man who had endured the indignities of homelessness recoiled at being turned into a human interest story. If I do this, he said finally, I want it to be about the system, not about me. No photographs, no details about. He gestured to Judge Parker, indicating his connection to her brother. Judge Parker nodded. I can speak with the reporter off the record, provide context without making you the center of the story. As they discussed how to navigate the media interest, another figure appeared at the courtroom door. Dr. Elaine Wilson, director of the local VA Medical Center, who had been contacted by Judge Parker's clerk during the recess. Judge Parker, Dr. Wilson said, as she approached, I came as soon as I heard we've been trying to locate Mr. Quinn for months. Mason looked confused. Why? Dr. Wilson took a seat beside him. Sergeant Quinn, there was a comprehensive review of cases affected by the 2021 system migration. Your file was flagged for immediate resolution nearly 6 months ago, but we had no way to contact you. I've been right here. Mason said, a rare edge of bitterness in his voice. Sleeping 2 blocks from your office most nights. Dr. Wilson had the grace to look ashamed. The system failed you, Sergeant. I can't change that, but I can fix it going forward. She opened her tablet and showed him a screen full of official forms. Your disability rating has been corrected to 100%, backdated to your original application. The retroactive benefits alone amount to over $175,000. Mason stared at the figure in disbelief. Additionally, Dr. Wilson continued, we've expedited your application for the Comprehensive Caregiver Program. You qualify for full medical benefits, including the knee replacement surgery you've been waiting for. It was almost too much to process. After years of struggling simply to survive, Mason was suddenly facing a whirlwind of change. Why now? He asked, suspicion born of disappointment clouding his voice. What's different today? Dr. Wilson glanced at Judge Parker before answering, honestly, the system is broken, and sometimes it takes someone with influence pushing from the outside to make things happen. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. The harsh truth hung in the air. Mason's case was moving forward not because the system had suddenly started working, but because he had accidentally appeared before a judge with a personal connection and the power to make calls. What about the others? Mason asked quietly. The ones who don't end up in front of the right judge? The question silenced the room. It was the challenge at the heart of the problem, not just helping one veteran, but fixing a system that abandoned too many. By late afternoon, Mason's immediate crisis had transformed into something much larger. Judge Parker had cleared her docket for the remainder of the day, an unprecedented move that had the court administrator checking the rule book, and her chambers had become the command center for what Alex was now calling Operation Homecoming. Dr. Michael Parker had been reached in Minneapolis and was now on speakerphone, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke to Mason for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Sergeant Quinn, I've been trying to find you for years. Michael said, after my residency, I started working at the VA specifically because of what happened to you and the others who brought me home. Mason, overwhelmed by the day's events, could barely respond. You didn't owe me anything, son. I owed you everything, Michael countered, and I'm not the only one. There are 15 other Marines from our unit who came home because of actions you took that day. And in the weeks that followed, Judge Parker, who had been conferring with Alex and Dr. Wilson, rejoined the conversation. Michael, I've been thinking about what Mason said about the others who don't have someone to champion their cause. What if we use this situation to create something more permanent? I'm already ahead of you, sis, Michael replied. I've been working on a pilot program here in Minneapolis, a rapid response team that cuts through the red tape for veterans in crisis. We've helped over 200 veterans in the past year, but we need to expand. Dr. Wilson nodded enthusiastically. The VA has funding for innovative programs, but bureaucracy gets in the way of implementation. If we had a federal judge and a VA physician, both advocating, and a dedicated legal team, Alex added, my firm would commit pro bono hours. As they discussed the possibilities, Mason watched in silent amazement. The system that had ignored him for years was suddenly bending over backward, not just for him, but potentially for thousands of others. It was like watching a miracle unfold, except it wasn't divine intervention, but simply people with power choosing to use it for good. The door opened again, and Richard Townsend returned with a set of keys and a folder. Everything's ready, Mr. Quinn. He said, the house is at 1472 Maple Street. It's fully furnished and stocked with essentials. The property manager is expecting you whenever you're ready. Mason took the keys with a trembling hand. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Townsend replied. The bank's Veterans Initiative is expanding, by the way. We're identifying 10 more properties that can be converted to transitional housing for homeless vets. As the pieces continued falling into place, Judge Parker checked her watch. The regular afternoon session is about to begin. I need to return to the bench. She looked at Mason. Would you be willing to stay? There's something I'd like to do before you leave. Mason nodded, curious but tired. The emotional roller coaster of the day had drained what little energy his street-hardened body maintained. Alex helped Mason back to the courtroom, where the afternoon docket was already filling with defendants, attorneys, and spectators. As they took their seats in the now reserved front row, Mason noticed several men and women in military uniforms entering through a side door. "What's happening?" he whispered to Alex. "Judge Parker made some calls." Alex replied cryptically. At precisely 1:30, the bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Parker took the bench. Rather than proceeding immediately to the docket, however, she addressed the crowded room. "Before we begin the afternoon session, the court has a special matter to address." She gestured to the uniformed military personnel. "We are honored to have with us today Captain James Reynolds of the United States Marine Corps and representatives from the Department of the Navy." A distinguished officer in full-dress blues stepped forward. "Thank you. Your Honor, I'm here today to correct a long-overdue oversight." He turned to face Mason. "Sergeant Mason Quinn, please step forward," confused but compliant. Mason rose with difficulty. Alex supported his elbow as he made his way to stand before the captain. Captain Reynolds produced an official document and read aloud. "The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Navy Cross to Sergeant Mason Quinn, United States Marine Corps, for extraordinary heroism while serving as squad leader, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, during operations in Fallujah, Iraq, on 17 November 2004. Mason's eyes widened in shock as Captain Reynolds continued reading the citation, which detailed his actions in rescuing multiple Marines while grievously wounded himself. Sergeant Quinn's decisive leadership, uncommon valor, and unwavering devotion to duty reflected great credit upon himself and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. As the citation concluded, every member of the military present snapped to attention and saluted Captain Reynolds, then opened a polished wooden box containing the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration awarded for valor in combat. "On behalf of a grateful nation, I present you with the Navy Cross, Sergeant Quinn." The entire courtroom had risen to its feet. Mason, overwhelmed, stood ramrod straight despite his aching knee, returning the salute with the precision ingrained by decades of service. As Captain Reynolds pinned the decoration to Mason's worn jacket, the incongruity of the prestigious medal against the threadbare fabric lost on no one. Judge Parker stepped down from the bench. Protocol was cast aside completely as she approached Mason. "The Navy Cross was approved 20 years ago," she said quietly. "The paperwork was processed but never delivered when your unit was redeployed. It's been sitting in administrative limbo all this time, just like you have been." Mason looked down at the medal, then up at the room full of people standing in respect. For a man who had been invisible on the streets for years, the visibility was almost too much to bear. Judge Parker sensed his discomfort. "Court is adjourned for a 30-minute recess," she announced, giving Mason a chance to retreat from the spotlight. 6 months later, the steps of the Riverdale courthouse presented a very different scene. The winter chill had given way to spring warmth. and Mason Quinn stood on the steps, not as a defendant, but as an honored guest. He leaned less heavily on his cane. Now the knee replacement surgery had been successful, though decades of damage couldn't be completely undone. Beside him stood Judge Olivia Parker, Dr. Michael Parker, who had transferred to the Riverdale VA Medical Center, Alexander Rossi, and a dozen other individuals who had become part of what the local paper had dubbed the Quinn Initiative. Behind them, a new sign was unveiled: Veterans Justice Center, a dedicated courthouse division focused exclusively on veterans facing legal challenges related to homelessness, mental health, and substance abuse. Judge Parker stepped to the microphone. 6 months ago, a clerical error and a coincidence brought Sergeant Mason Quinn into my courtroom. What could have been just another case of a homeless veteran facing minor charges instead became a catalyst for change. She gestured to the building behind her. This Veterans Justice Center is the first of its kind in our state, a place where the legal system doesn't punish veterans for the trauma they endured in service, but instead connects them with the resources they've earned and deserve. Alexander Rossi spoke next, outlining how his law firm had partnered with the VA to create a legal aid program specifically for veterans navigating benefits claims. In the first 4 months alone, we've helped resolve cases for over 100 veterans in our community. He reported the average wait time for decisions has been reduced from years to weeks. Dr. Michael Parker detailed the medical component, a rapid response team that could provide immediate care while paperwork was being processed rather than making veterans wait for treatment until after administrative hurdles were cleared. As the formal speeches concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Mason remained on the steps, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the attention, but proud of what had been accomplished. Richard Townsend approached him. "How's the house working out?" Mason smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "It's not just a house anymore, it's a home." He paused, "and not just for me." What had begun as temporary housing for one veteran had evolved into a shared residence for 3. Mason had insisted on opening his doors to 2 younger veterans he'd met at the VA, both struggling with PTSD and the transition to civilian life. "They helped me with the yard work," Mason said with a slight shrug, downplaying his role as mentor and guide to the younger men, "and I helped them navigate the system." Judge Parker joined them. "Mason refuses to accept full credit, but this wouldn't have happened without him," she told Townsend. "His willingness to share his story, despite his preference for privacy, has changed how our community sees veterans in crisis." Indeed, the Quinn Initiative had expanded beyond legal and medical services. Local businesses had created a veterans employment network. The bank's housing program had grown to include 15 properties. The community college had established a scholarship fund. As the crowd thinned, Mason found himself alone with Judge Parker and her brother. "I still think you both go overboard with all this," he said, gesturing to the courthouse and the ceremony. "I was just in the right place at the right time." "That's what heroes always say," Michael replied with a smile. "But the real test of character isn't what you do in a moment of crisis. It's what you do day after day when no one's watching and no one seems to care." Judge Parker nodded in agreement. "You carried my brother out of Fallujah when you could barely walk yourself. But what's even more remarkable is how you've carried the weight of what happened afterward without becoming bitter or giving up." Mason looked away, uncomfortable with praise, but unable to deny the truth in their words. I had dark times, he admitted, nights when I wondered if it would be easier to just stop fighting. What kept you going? Michael asked quietly. Mason considered the question. The same thing that got me through Fallujah, I suppose. The knowledge that giving up wouldn't just affect me, that somewhere out there were people who might need me to keep going, even if I didn't know who they were yet. He glanced at the new Veterans Justice Center sign. I never expected any of this. All I wanted was a warm place to sleep. And all I wanted was to get through my morning docket, Judge Parker added with a smile. Sometimes life has other plans. As they walked slowly down the courthouse steps, Mason paused to look back at the building where his fortune had changed so dramatically. You know what still bothers me? He said, the randomness of it all. If I hadn't been in your courtroom that day, if you hadn't recognized my name. Judge Parker nodded soberly. That's why this can't stop with you, Mason. The system shouldn't require coincidences and connections to work properly. It shouldn't, Mason agreed. But until it changes, I'm glad we're creating a few more coincidences for the ones still out there. As they reached the bottom of the steps, a young man in a worn military jacket approached hesitantly. Mason recognized him from the VA waiting room, a recently returned veteran who hadn't yet found his footing. Sergeant Quinn, the young man asked tentatively. They told me at the center that you might be able to help me figure out my housing voucher. Without hesitation, Mason turned toward him. Let's sit down and go through it, he said, gesturing to a nearby bench. I've got time. Judge Parker and her brother watched as Mason, once invisible on these very streets, became the lifeline for another veteran. The Navy Cross that had arrived 20 years too late now glinted in the spring sunshine, not from a display case, but pinned to the jacket Mason wore as he continued his most important mission, ensuring that no one who served would be left behind on the battlefield or at home. In a system built on precedent, one case had created a new one, changing not just a single life, but potentially thousands. And it had all begun with a homeless veteran seeking shelter from the cold and a judge who looked beyond the charges to see the man behind them.